Under the Whyte notation for the classification of steam locomotives, 040 represents one of the simplest possible types, that with 2 axles and 4 coupled wheels, all of which are driven. In normal circumstances, the wheels on each end of the axles are connected with coupling rods to form a single driven set. In Britain, the Whyte notation of wheel arrangement was also often used for the classification of electric and diesel-electric locomotives with side rod coupled driving wheels. Other equivalent classifications are UIC classification B, French classification 020, Turkish classification 22, Swiss classification 2 halves, Russian classification 020. In the UIC classification used in Europe and, in more recent years, in simplified form in the United States, an 040 is classified as B if the axles are connected by side rods or gearing, and 020 independent of axle motoring. The UIC SPO classification indicates that the axles are independently motored, which would be 020 in the Whyte notation. Overview. 040 locomotives were built as tank locomotives as well as tender locomotives. The former was more common in Europe and the latter in the United States, except in the tightest of situations such as that of a shop switcher where overall length was a concern. The terms 4-wheeled and 4-coupled are often used for 040 locomotives, but these terms can also encompass other wheel arrangements. For example, Stephenson's Rocket was an 022 4-wheeled locomotive, a 4-wheeled configuration, where all the wheels are driving wheels, uses all the locomotive's mass for traction but is inherently unstable at speed. The type was therefore mainly used for switches and shunters. Because of the lack of stability, tender engines of this type were only built for a few decades in the UK. They were built for a longer period in the USA. The possible tractive effort of an 040 within normal axle load limits was not enough to move large loads. By 1900 they had therefore largely been superseded for most purposes by locomotives with more complex wheel arrangements. They nevertheless continued to be used in situations where tighter radius curves existed and the shorter length was an advantage. Thus, they were commonly employed in dockyard work, industrial tramways, or as shop switches. 040 tank engines were introduced in the early 1850s. The type was found to be so useful in many locations that they continued to be built for more than a century and existed until the end of the steam era. The wheel arrangement is also used on specialized types such as fireless locomotives, crane tanks, tram engines and geared steam locomotives. It was also widely used on narrow-gauge railways. Usage. Australia. In New South Wales, the Rego Steam Railway and Museum has preserved 12 040 steam locomotives and 8 040 diesel locomotives. A total of 20 examples, all on the one site. Angola. The Katumbela Sugar Estate in Angola operated a narrow-gauge line on the estate. One of their 040 locomotives, Ruotala Machine and Fabric 963 of 1929, was later rebuilt with a diesel engine. Finland had the E1 and VK4 classes with an 040 wheel arrangement. The E1 was a class of only 2 locomotives, numbered 76 and 77. The VK4 was also a class of only 2 locomotives, built by Borsig Locomotive Worker of Germany in 1910. The VK4s were used at a fortress, and were eventually also used in dismantling the fortress, after which one locomotive went into industrial use and was scrapped in 1951. The other was sold to the Finnish Railways and nicknamed Leena. It became No. 1968 and is now the oldest working broad-gauge locomotive in Finland, being preserved at the Finnish Railway Museum, Indonesia. The Semarang Cirebon Stumtram imported 27 standard-gauge 4OT locomotives of the B-52 class between 1908 and 1911, originally to operate services from Kalibrodi Semarang to Tanggung and Yogyakarta. They were built by Saxica Maschinenfabrik in Chemnitz, Germany. They were a modern locomotive designed for the time, equipped with a superheater. The largest allocation of B-52 class locomotives was in Tegal, Central Java for services to Purwokerto. Some were later converted to tram engines and worked in Tegal and Purwokerto. All 27 locomotives were in existence at the end of 1960, but by 1970 only 15 units remained. 2 locomotives have been preserved: B5212 at the Taman Mini Indonesia Indo Museum of Transport and B5210 at the Railway Museum Ambarawa, New Zealand NZRA class, several preserved. South Africa. Gwernol gauge. In 1847 the government of the Cape Colony established harbour boards at its 3 major ports: Table Bay, Port Elizabeth and East London. While railway lines were laid at all these harbours, trains were for the most part initially hauled by oxen or mules. The first steam locomotives to see service at these harbours were 7 feet 1/4 in Gwernol gauge engines, which were placed in service on breakwater construction at Table Bay Harbour in 1862 and East London Harbour in 1874. At Table Bay Harbour a third Gwernol gauge 4OT locomotive was acquired from Fletcher, Jennings and Ampco in 1874 to haul dip wagons from the excavation site to the breakwater which was being constructed simultaneously. The East London Harbour's construction locomotives were 4O vertical boiler engines, similar in appearance to the American Grasshopper type. 4 of them were acquired from Alexander Chaplin and Ampco between 1873 and 1880, although the first one was only placed in service in 1874. A 4th locomotive was added at Table Bay Harbour in 1879, a 4O World tank engine, also built by Fletcher, Jennings. 3 of the 16 saddle tank locomotives of 1881 to 1904 gauge below, 2 in 1881 and 1 more in 1893, were built to broad gauge for breakwater construction service at the Table Bay Harbour. Broad gauge. In September 1859 Messrs. E. and Amp. J. Pickering, contractors to the Cape Town Railway and Dock Company for the construction of the Cape Town-Wellington Railway line, imported a small 4 feet 8½ in broad gauge 4O side tank steam locomotive from England for use during the construction of the railway. This was the first locomotive in South Africa. In 1874 the locomotive was rebuilt to a 4-2T configuration before it was shipped to Port Alfred, where it served as construction locomotive on the banks of the Cowie River and was nicknamed Blackie. It has been declared a heritage object and was plinthade in the main concourse of Cape Town Station. The first railway locomotive to run in revenue-earning service in South Africa was a small broad-gauge 4OWT well tank engine named Natal, manufactured by Garrett, Marshall and Company of Leeds. It made its inaugural run from Market Square to Point Station in Durban during the official opening of the first operating railway in South Africa, on Tuesday, the 26th of June 1860. In 1865 the Natal Railway Company obtained a saddle tank locomotive with a 4 wheel arrangement from Kitson and Company. This was the Natal Railway's second locomotive and was named Urban. In 1878, while construction work by the Cowie Harbour Improvement Company was underway at Port Alfred, the Cape Government Railways acquired one broad-gauge 040 St locomotive named Aid from Fox, Walker and Company of Bristol for use as construction locomotive on the east bank of the Cowie River. Cape Gauge. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of 040 tank and saddle tank locomotives were imported into South Africa, many of them for use in harbours. Many of these locomotives came into South African Railways stock in 1912 but were never classified. 1873 In 1873 and 1874 3 Cape Gauge saddle tank locomotives were placed in service by the Cape Government Railways, 2 on the Midland System in 1873 and the third on the Western System in 1874. They were the first Cape Gauge locomotives to enter service in South Africa. 1874 In 1874 a third saddle tank locomotive, also built by Manning Wardle, was delivered to the Midland System of the CGR in Port Elizabeth. The locomotive was of a smaller design than the earlier 2040 St locomotives of 1873. 1875 to 1882 Between 1875 and 1882 6 saddle tank locomotives, with domeless boilers and 3 with domes were placed in service on all 3 systems of the CGR. They were designated first class when a classification system was adopted. 1881 In 1881 2 Cape Gauge saddle tank locomotives with a 040 wheel arrangement were placed in service by Teague and Company, who operated Teague's tramway at the Kimberley Diamond Mine. In 1885 one was sold to the mine and the other to the Cape Government Railways for use during the construction of a temporary rail bridge across the Orange River at Norvalspont. In the process the CGR locomotive, nicknamed Coffee Pot, became the first locomotive to run across the border between the Cape Colony and the Orange Free State. 16 saddle tank locomotives were acquired by the Table Bay Harbour Board from Black, Hawthorne and Company, Chapman and Furneaux and Hawthorne Leslie and Company between 1881 and 1904. 3 of them were delivered built to Brunel Gauge and used in breakwater construction in Table Bay Harbour. 13 survived to come into SAR stock in 1912 but were not included in the renumbering schedules. 1889 In 1889 the Nederlandse Zuid-Afrikaanse Spoorwegmaatschappij obtained its first 6 locomotives for use on the new line which was being constructed from Johannesburg to Boksburg, 1 13-tonner and 5 very similar 14-tonners. In 1889 and 1890 the NZASM obtained 3 10-tonner tramway locomotives for use on the new line from Johannesburg to Boksburg which became known as the Rantrim Line. 1891 In 1891 5 saddle tank locomotives were imported built by Nielsen and Company for the Natal Government Railways. 1 was later sold to the Pretoria-Petersburg Railway, where it was named Natal, while 2 more went to the Harbour Board of Natal. The remaining 2 were later included in the NGR's Class K. In 1912 4 of these locomotives, including the ex-PPR locomotive, were taken onto the SAR roster as obsolete unclassified locomotives. 1894 Between 1894 and 1902 8 saddle tank locomotives were acquired by the Port Elizabeth Harbour Board for shunting service at the Port Elizabeth Harbour. 4 built by Black Hawthorne in 1894 and 1895, 2 by Chapman and Furneaux in 1900 and 2 by Hudswell Clark in 1902. 1902. In 1902, the Harbours Department of the Natal Government placed a single 040 saddle tank locomotive in service as harbour shunter in Durban Harbour. It was built by Hudswell Clark and named Congela. 1903. In 1903, a single 040 St locomotive built by New Lauka Engineering was delivered to the Port Elizabeth Harbour Board. After the harbour boards were disbanded, some locomotives entered Sa Harbour service as previously owned. Two locomotives named Stormberg and Thebes were originally built by Hudswell Clark for the South African Public Works Department in 1903. They were acquired by the SA in 1916, but were named instead of being classified and numbered. 1906, the CGR acquired a single self-contained rail motor with a 040T plus four-wheel arrangement for low-volume passenger service. The rail motor was a 040 side-tank locomotive with a passenger coach as an integral part of the locomotive itself, with a four-wheeled bogie under the coach end. 1907. In 1907, the Central South African Railways also acquired a single self-contained rail motor with a 040T plus four-wheel arrangement. 1929. In 1929, the South African Railways acquired a single self-contained Clayton rail motor with a 040 plus four-wheel arrangement for low-volume passenger service. The vehicle was a vertical boilered steam locomotive with a passenger coach which was an integral part of the locomotive itself. 1939. In 1941, long after the harbour boards had ceased to exist, a contractor's locomotive which had been imported c. 1939 for use on the foreshore land reclamation project in Cape Town was bought by the SA for use as dock shunter in Table Bay Harbour. It had been built in 1909 by Orenstein and Amp Copland on the SA. It was numbered SA H and Amp NW No. 69. Narrow gauges. Between 1886 and 1888, three well-tank condensing locomotives were placed in service by the Cape Copper Mining Company on its 2 feet 6 in Namaqualand Railway between Port Nolloth and Ouokeepe in the Cape Colony. They were the first condensing steam locomotives to enter service in South Africa. They were later rebuilt as conventional well-tank locomotives. In 1899, Rand Mines acquired two narrow-gauge tank steam locomotives from Avonside Engine Company, and in 1900 a similar locomotive was delivered to Reynolds Brothers Sugar Estates in Natal. In 1915, when an urgent need arose for additional narrow-gauge locomotives in German Southwest Africa during the First World War, these three locomotives were purchased second-hand by the South African Railways. In 1900, the British War Office placed two Cedar-class 040T tank steam locomotives in service on a 2-feet narrow-gauge line near Germiston in the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic, where the Royal Engineers had established a siege park during the Second Boer War. The locomotives were built by Kurt Stewart and Company. At the end of the war, the two Cedar locomotives were sold to a farmer who used them on a firewood line between Pienaar-Rivier and Pankop, until the line and locomotives were taken over by the Central South African Railways. In 1912, when these locomotives were assimilated into the SA, they were renumbered with an ANG prefix to the numbers. When a system of grouping narrow-gauge locomotives into classes was eventually introduced by the SA somewhere between 1928 and 1930, they were classified as Class NG1. In 1902, the Cape Government Railways placed a single narrow-gauge tank steam locomotive in service on the Avontuur branch, built by Manning Wardle, classified Type C in named Midget. In 1912, this locomotive was assimilated into the South African Railways and renumbered. It was sold to the West Rand Consolidated Mines near Krugersdorp in 1921. A single small 5-ton locomotive built by Krauss and Amp Company was purchased by the Cape Government Railways c. 1903 and placed in service as construction engine on the narrow-gauge Avontuur branch out of Port Elizabeth, United Kingdom. Tank locomotives. The tank engine version of the wheel arrangement began to appear in the UK in the early 1850s, with the first significant class being 6 saddle tanks designed by Robert Sinclair for the Caledonian Railway. By 1860 the type was very popular and it continued to be built in significant numbers for both mainline and industrial railways, almost to the end of steam traction. Hardswell Clark were supplying industrial saddle tanks until at least 1947, and both Barclay and Robert Stevenson and Hawthorns until 1949. An interesting variation on this theme were the traction engine-based railway locomotives built by Aveling and Porter. The last British Railways 040 St Dock shunters were built by Horwich Works as late as 1955 and survived until 1966. Tender locomotives. Richard Trevithick's Coal-Brookerdale, Penn White Arun and Newcastle locomotives were of the 040 type, although in those cases the wheels were connected by a single-gear wheel. The first 040 to use coupling rods was Locomotion No. 1 built by Robert Stevenson and Company for the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825. Stevenson also built the Lancashire which in 1828, and Timothy Hackworth built Sanspareil which ran at the Rainhill Trials in 1829. The latter two locomotives later worked on the Bolton and Lee Railway. During the 1840s the wheel arrangement was widely used by Edward Berry on the bar-framed locomotives built for the London and Birmingham Railway. However, with the exception of a few isolated examples used by the smaller companies such as the Cambrian Railways, the Furness Railway and the Taff Vale Railway, and 4 examples built by Edward Fletcher of the North Eastern Railway between 1854 and 1868. The 040 tender locomotive had been largely superseded on Britain's mainline railways by 1850. United States of America tank locomotives. An early example of the 040 type was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Atlantic No. 2, built in 1832 by Phineas Davis and Israel Gardner. In the USA the 040 tank locomotive was principally used for industrial railway purposes. Tender locomotives in the USA. The best friend of Charleston was the first locomotive to be built entirely within the United States. It was built in 1830 for the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company by the West Point Foundry of New York. The John Bull was built by Robert Stevenson and Company for the Camden and Amboy Railroad in New Jersey in 1831, but was later rebuilt as a 240. The Pennsylvania Railroad kept producing 040 classes long after all other major railroads had abandoned development of the type, building the final A5S class into the 1920s. The A5S was a monster among 040s, larger than many 060 designs, with modern features found on few others of its type, such as superheating, power reverse, piston valves, and several others. The Pennsy continued to build the type because it had a large amount of confined and tight industrial track, more than most other railroads had. 040 diesel locomotives. The wheel arrangement was also used on a number of small 0 to 4-0 German Marx diesel mechanical shunters produced by John Fowler and Amp Co. and other builders in the 1930s and earlier. Similarly, it was perpetuated on a number of diesel mechanical and 040DH diesel hydraulic classes between 1953 and 1960. Many of these were later sold for industrial use. There are 4-odor diesel-electric locomotives too, although small in number. The smallest diesel switches, such as the EMD Model 40, were of this arrangement.